Good evening. I'm Paula Goldstein, President and CEO of JFCS of Greater Philadelphia, and I am delighted to be moderating our Facebook Live this evening about trauma. JFCS has committed itself to trauma-informed care, training all of our staff in how to be trauma-informed when working with people that we serve. And we also have a trauma-informed lens in working with staff as well, and we try and support each other through that. I'm so happy this evening and proud to be working with two wonderful social workers and experts from JFCS, Carly Bruski, Director of JFCS's Holocaust Support Program. Denise Crosby is JFCS's Program Manager for ELECT, Team Parenting, and our parenting program. And also Deborah Bornstein, JFCS's Director of Donor and Event Operations, who will serve as our technology facilitator this evening. So let's get started. Carly, first question for you. Why don't you give us an overview of trauma? Tell us what it is.
Sure. So thank you for having me today. I'm really thrilled to be here. I thought that it would be good to kick off the discussion with just a broad definition of what individual trauma is. And that results from an event or a series of events experienced by an individual that is overwhelming or negatively life-changing, and that has profound effects on an individual's biopsychosocial development or well-being. So trauma really shapes a person's day-to-day. It shapes their belief system after having experienced trauma, their identity, their worldview, their spirituality. So it is not uncommon for a person to get stuck really in a cycle of re-experiencing those traumatic events, because trauma is so complex and it really permeates the day-to-day. So just to give you an idea of the scope, the National Council for Community Behavioral Health Care states that 70% of adults just living in the US have experienced at least one, if not more, traumatic events in their lifetime. So it's a pretty staggering number.
And I guess it's safe to say that given what we have been coping with over the last several months, first the pandemic, and then the state of unrest in our city and our country over the last 2 weeks, that trauma for individuals really may have been spiked.
Good point. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And Denise, do you want to say a little bit about kids, our youth, and what some of the early warning indicators are for children and kids with trauma?
Surely. Related to our children and how trauma affects them, I'm going to refer to adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. ACEs are traumatic events occurring before the age of 18. ACEs includes all types of abuse and neglect, as well as parenting, parental mental health, substance abuse, divorce, incarceration, domestic abuse, and even community abuse and violence. The more ACEs experience, the greater the risk of their traumatic experiences, the greater a risk of their outcome and their behaviors and how it affects them internally.
Okay.
Some of the signs that parents can look for, certainly in children preschool age, you may see them being crying more. You may see them perhaps regressing with separation anxiety. They're going back to not really wanting you to leave and be out of their sight. Poor eating habits may develop. Certainly having more nightmares. In elementary school ages, you're going to see that they may become more fearful, more anxious, feeling or talking about guilt or shame, having a difficult time concentrating, and also difficulty sleeping. In our middle school and high school children, you probably may see feelings of depression and sadness, certainly developing eating disorders, and we also see self-harm behaviors, risk-taking behaviors. There may be beginning of alcohol abuse or use, including drugs, and maybe some sexual activity. So those are some of the symptoms that parents can look out for.
Okay, thank you. Question, what does it mean to be trauma informed? Carly, why don't you talk to us about vulnerable and older adults first, and then we'll go to Denise.
Sure, yeah, if I could just make a quick point too, Denise just reminded me of an example of historical or intergenerational trauma before I get into what it means to being trauma informed or even connected to that. Just an example of historical and intergenerational trauma. We can look at things like slavery, the Holocaust, the colonization of Native Americans, all of these things that have happened where the trauma then is passed down between generations. So I just wanted to note that trauma does embed itself on our DNA and then results in those negative health outcomes that Denise was mentioning. It can affect parenting style, parent-child attachment, among other things. We really just want to be aware of how trauma is passed along. And I was thinking of that in terms of older adults, and I'll go a little bit into that as we talk about being trauma informed.
So Carly, one question first though about what you just said, because I think it's so interesting, intergenerational trauma, but is there collective trauma amongst communities of people who have been through trauma generation after generation?
Absolutely, and I can speak to that. In the Holocaust survivor community, we work with, of course, survivors, but also with the second generation and even the third generation. And there is this collective feeling of trauma, and there's also the commitment to having to pass those stories and experiences along. So retelling the story over and over again can be re-traumatizing to those second and third generations, as well as to the survivor themselves, who are, potentially reliving that every day through flashbacks or the resurfacing of trauma as they age, in conjunction with those aging issues we're all familiar with. As we enter our 70s, 80s, 90s, we're faced with a slew of health complexities and aging issues that are normal, but those are often exacerbated by trauma.
Okay, thank you.
So being trauma informed in general really means understanding the magnitude of trauma and the impact of trauma on someone's life, and then how we can sensitively and holistically respond to it. So trauma, again, permeates everything, and it really destabilizes a person's feeling of safety. And that can be physical safety, emotional safety, or psychological safety. So to be in a trauma-informed system or agency, it really means integrating the knowledge around trauma into all components of that system: the policies, procedures, office environments, and direct services. So a few examples would just be being aware of the type of lighting you may have, being aware of how many exits you may have, and if people are aware of where those exits are, making sure there's someone who speaks the language of the person that you're serving, making sure we're aware of our body language, whether or not we're touching someone, if that's welcome or not. I know working with survivors of a war, they're often triggered by loud noises or sirens or things like that. So our role as someone who's trauma sensitive is to be very transparent and helpful in what those are, what a siren is going off for, what it means, when it's going to stop, if we know, and just helping to explain the environment to bring people back into the moment.
Got it. Denise, before you give us some examples of children and teens, do you want to comment at all around collective trauma and the impact that may have on children?
Certainly. So collective trauma, historical trauma, particularly in the minority community, are often intergenerational, excuse me. Those are experiences that have been shared by parents, grandparents, but it's also are reoccurring currently with some of our children being exposed to them today. Um, Economic disparities, health disparities, things of those natures help contribute to that reoccurring trauma that the community or historical context of a people or communities experiences, traumatic experiences.
Okay. And do you feel that through the death of George Floyd, that children may experience that as traumatic, particularly in the minority communities?
Certainly, I really believe that all children potentially could be viewing this in a traumatic way. But certainly the African American community, because it is something that is lived, that is known of. Often our children are exposed or talked to about the traumatic experiences that their parents, grandparents, community members have experienced. And they're often also given tutelage of how to avoid conflicts or staying safe and things of that nature. So seeing this on screen, there is a direct connection of what they already know to be true. For children of other races, depending on if they have been exposed to what is race, they may have a context, but just by the visual effects or hearing about it, it certainly could be traumatic to that child.
And any recommendations from Carly, you or Denise, on how, given the events of the past couple of weeks, you would talk to people about trauma that they're experiencing?
So if I may, I just wanted to highlight what it is to be a trauma-informed parent.
Yes.
And that really is what we've talked about, acknowledging that your child may have had traumatic experiences and recognizing that how those behaviors may manifest from those experiences. So you're supporting in that context. Your first thought is not what is wrong with you. Why are you behaving like this? It is what happened. And that sort of kind of changes your mindset, how you approach working with your child and parenting your child and supporting your child. Also, I wanted to focus in on having the parent also be keenly aware of themselves. So self-awareness is very, very important because often people who have ACEs or have experienced traumatic events that may be in the back of their mind and they're not fully cognizant of it. And so behaviors, reactions may come out that is surprising. So when working with your child, supporting your child is very, very important for you to have a self-awareness as to your own personal experience, and to get that support around that so that you will be totally present for your child.
Thank you. Carly, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the common symptoms? And before you do, let me just encourage anyone that is watching this to ask questions in the Facebook comments. Thank you.
Yes, so in terms of managing trauma, I think that the first thing we want to do really is to just recognize how trauma can manifest. So keeping kind of a checklist in the back of our minds, if we're experiencing these things, or we know someone who are experiencing these things, they could be indicators. So things like feelings of fear, depression, anxiety, having uncontrollable thoughts, or feelings of self-blame, a decrease in interest in your everyday activities, an increased use of drugs or alcohol, emotional swings, aches and pains like stomach aches, back aches, headaches. All of these things can be PTSD indicators. And just to throw it out there, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a mental health condition that is triggered by a traumatic event. So that would be step one. I would think, just recognizing what trauma can look like. And then the follow-up to that would be just acknowledging and Denise spoke very beautifully about acknowledging and validating what people are feeling and how they're expressing it, because that can vary from person to person. So that question of what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, that tone shift is completely non-judgmental, and it will really make the communication and the relationship building a lot more seamless. One other thing I want to mention too is I think something that can be really helpful around managing trauma is having a safety plan in place, whether that's for yourself or again, for someone you know or someone that you work with. And that safety plan is a prioritized written list of coping strategies for when you're experiencing a resurgence or a resurfacing of trauma. So when you're triggered or you're expecting a trigger, you can have this list already prepped and ready to go. These are some coping strategies that work for you. These are some resources that you are aware of, or here are some contact names and numbers of supportive coworkers, friends, family members, neighbors that can help ground you a little bit when you need that support.
Okay, thank you. Denise, do you want to talk a little bit about how you would talk to kids about their own trauma, and also highlight a little bit of how a parent might want to talk to a child in today's climate?
Yes. What I would say is, if your child has gone through a traumatic experience, you want to acknowledge it, and you want to encourage your child at their own pace to share their experience, to share their feelings, more importantly, and not so much of the focus of the actual experience, but their feelings, okay? So really having that open door invitation with your child to recognize that they may not be feeling really well, and that you're there to listen, most importantly, okay? We as parents, we often feel like we need to know everything. We need to have all the answers, and we don't. And then when we don't have those answers, we either feel very intimidated or avoidant in addressing things. So just know going in, you're not supposed to know all of the answers. This is the opportunity for your child to lead you in exploring how they're feeling, okay? In addition to how they're feeling, you really want them to be in tune. So if they don't have the words, and this is children of all ages, you want to work on identifying words that's descriptive to how they're feeling. Oftentimes that may look like having them draw a picture and you interpreting what you see to make sure that the communication is correct. I know working with older children, they could be sitting right next to you, but perhaps texting, so that they feel a lot more comfortable communicating via text. Would be a method that I would think of, just to encourage whatever the format that they're comfortable in communicating their feelings and getting in touch with their feelings. Going through a traumatic experience is one thing. It's scary, but then the after effects that you carry around can be even more scary. So just really equipping them with the understanding and the knowledge of this is fear. And this fear is coming from what I experienced in the past, opposed to I'm losing my mind. Does that make sense?
So important. So
Yes.
important.
Yes. Yes. And then as it relates to the current events, again, I think it's very helpful to have a context to draw from, to have a foundation to draw from. So this may be the first opportunity you have to talk about race and the differences of race and all of that means historically, just visually what we see, things of that nature, get their understanding of the different races. So to understand that first, and then put it in connection with the historical happenings of a minority group. For this particular situation, it's African Americans, and the history, as Carly shared, of slavery and Jim Crow days, and how things have progressed to today, but how they sadly have remained the same systematically. And to have them to understand that there are people who, based off of their own views, behave and treat other people differently. And this is a reaction to that, not only just someone brutally life being taken away right before our eyes, but the whole implication and history of that's associated with. That will give an understanding of the protests, that will give somewhat of an understanding of the riots. So it's really an excellent opportunity, if you've not had this conversation with your children, to really open that up.
Thank you so much. Deb, how are we doing on questions before I know whether to ask some more?
We actually have a question from somebody on Facebook. Their question is, can hearing about other people's trauma cause trauma to you?
That's a great question. Carly, you want to take that?
Sure, yeah, that is a great question. There is such thing as compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. Compassion fatigue is very normal, and that is our physical and emotional reaction to hearing about other people's trauma. It can be further broken down into burnout and secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, but ultimately it's these symptoms that arise as we work with people who have experienced trauma, or even when we just talk to people who have experienced trauma or grief. There are ways to cope with it. So yes, it absolutely exists. It's very normal, but there are ways to cope with it. A tool that I really like is called Prevention ABC. So A stands for awareness, B stands for balance, and C stands for connection. It's really easy to remember. It can be difficult to, always implement, because it does take some commitment, and we have to step outside of ourselves sometimes and be really mindful, but it's a good thing to practice. Just being aware of ourselves, knowing when compassion fatigue is setting in. So when are times when we're feeling an unusually strong reaction to something? Is it watching the news? Is it reading the newspaper? And then what do we do when we're feeling extra stressed? So just keeping those questions in the back of your mind, like, when are the times when my functionality is altered? When do I feel easily frustrated or easily irritated? When do I struggle most? When do I feel like I'm working harder and harder and harder, yet accomplishing less and less and less? Or when do I feel like I have a ton of compassion for some people and then maybe not being involved with other people. Like what is happening that is a change from the norm and that's negative that we can then address with this B, which is balance. And that means balance, mind, body, and spirit. That's finding a sense of calm, finding a safe retreat, learn what restores and replenishes and rejuvenates us when we experience all of that compassion fatigue. Is it exercising? Is it taking time off of work? Is it meditating? Whatever works for you is at the second stage of what we then want to implement. And then the last thing, this connection, really is that support system that I've talked about in the past. Who in your life does not fuel your stress? That's who you want to reach out to in these moments of compassion fatigue, to talk through your stress, process your thoughts and reactions. And that could be anyone from a supervisor or a coworker to a family or a friend or even a pet. I mean, I'm a huge advocate of pet therapy. You know, some studies have shown that when you're around animals, your blood pressure decreases and your heart rate decreases. So whatever you like to do and whatever works for you is what you should employ there. But absolutely, I'm so glad you brought up the vicarious trauma piece because it is prevalent, especially now.
I would say that we're all incredibly vulnerable to this now. I remember people saying when the pandemic first hit that they had to turn off the TV. They could only watch a certain amount of news. They were so terrified at seeing, you know, all of the things that could potentially happen if you got the virus. And now watching the news again and seeing some of the unbelievably intense emotion and struggle and challenge that people are going through. It can be very, very traumatic to see. Of course, there are other parts of it too that are very hopeful in the way that it's causing everyone to come together. Mm-hmm. Denise, do you have any additional comment on this?
Sure, yes I do. In regards to how that looks and shows up in our parenting, you know, compassion fatigue is something that is very relevant. It's something that we are easily can find ourselves in if we don't do that self-awareness. So what that looks like is, you know, you may have a child that is going through traumatic event behaviors. And it's overwhelming, you know, the task at hand, and it's constant. And while you love that child, that's your love for your child is nowhere in question. You begin to think, okay, I'm not being able to meet my child's needs. I'm not letting this boogeyman go away in my child's life. I'm failing at that. I can't meet the need. And that goes back on ourselves sometimes if we're not careful. So I would invite people to, as Carly was indicating, that support group, you know, having someone that you can tag in, knowing your symptoms, how you're reacting, and then already have a system worked out that, you know, if you have somebody that has the bat phone and it rings, that means I need, you know, some support and a little bit of relief so that you can recharge, okay? As it relates to parenting and the current events, I also have found that whilst a lot of people recognize and, you know, there's a lot of solidarity in regards to the dismay and unrest in regards to what happened, sometimes we can get caught up with the good guy, bad guy. Mm. And if you're not part of that minority group, you may feel you're the bad guy by historical context. And then that compassion fatigue sort of kind of gets mixed up in that so that you turn away. It's not my problem. It'll all die off just for it to occur again. So just being aware of those things and understanding that there's really no blame in our parenting and how we view events today, there's no blame. There is acknowledgement and then the willingness to contribute to change.
So important, and I appreciate you giving parents permission to not have all the answers and to not blame themselves. So important. Deb, any questions? We can't hear you.
Yeah, I just realized I was muted. So how can I help my parent who is showing clear signs of being triggered by the trauma of the pandemic and the unrest in our country? How do I make my parent see that she needs help?
Harley?
That's a good question. And it's a tough question too. But I think that presenting options and resources and empowering your parent to, or parents to make that decision for themselves is the best way to go about it. It becomes really tough when we want to, impose what we want for someone, or we want to push someone in a certain direction. Of course, it's done from a place of love and support, but sometimes that can shut someone down. So I think that giving them options, resources, and a voice and a choice that would be the most trauma sensitive way to approach that situation. So maybe like, do you have friends that use a particular home health aid that they really like? Maybe we can get her in here to give you a hand, even for a couple hours. Are you okay with starting with like 5 hours a week of help, and we could see what happens there? Or, just maybe making some suggestions where it gives them the ultimate choice, but you're still tackling the problem. It's just in a mutual relationship, and it's not like telling someone what to do. It's making that decision together.
And if I may, you may see the difference. You may see symptoms that we've just discussed to help them identify if they have a change in their behavior or their reaction. Is also so that you're helping facilitate their own self enlightenment. That, yeah, I used to love going outside every day, couldn't wait, but now I'm very I don't want to go anywhere. I'm very fearful of going to the grocery store, those type of things. Just helping them in their own self-awareness of different changes that you may see, but they may not recognize.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Denise, too. If they are not recognizing a trigger or a potential trigger, I think just a general question as what has helped you in the past is always really useful too. So like, tell me how you're feeling right now. What's making you upset? And then when you felt this way in the past, what has traditionally helped you? And then maybe we can look into exploring that a little bit more. And if they say, I used to just be able to go outside and go for a walk and now I can't, it's acknowledging that must be really frustrating. Yeah, I mean, that's a shame. I know you used to do that all the time. What do you think we can replace that with temporarily until we can go outside again? Can you sit by the window, open it up now that it's nice out, and just kind of brainstorm around things that can take the place of something else during COVID?
Okay. Do we have one last question?
We actually do. What can you do to reduce the trauma that may be impacting our kids right now? Is the pandemic itself a trauma?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Is the pandemic
Itself a trauma?
For sure. Yes. In the context of one day, we're doing things that we normally would do, and then the next day, we can't go outside. We need to be homeschooled. I can't see my friends. All of these things taken abruptly from them could certainly be traumatic. So just as I shared, identifying those things, don't make assumptions. Ask, how are you feeling? We've been stuck in the house for 2.5 months, and I know how I feel. How do you feel about it? And have those types of probing questions that will allow them to answer open-endedly, to have them be aware again that they're really not liking what happened. And as a result of that, I can't sleep at night, those type of things. And then again, as was shared, is just like little techniques with helping them having them to draw out more information, having them to draw subject matters that are, heroes coming to the rescue, or what it looks like one day and what it could possibly look like the next day, a gloomy day, and tomorrow is going to be a brighter day. Like using drawing and illustration as a way of really helping younger kids to work through being traumatized by the pandemic. For older children, it is definitely more of having them lead you, in ways that they're going to be comfortable with. But just putting that out there, that one, it's been rough for you sharing your feelings about it, so that they can understand that there's a relatability, that, yeah, mommy's superwoman, the daddy's Superman, but this has really affected me and I don't really like it. And I like talking about it. That can encourage and give your child permission to start to explore their feelings and talk about their feelings.
Okay. I think that we are coming to the end. I wanted to ask Carly and Denise just a takeaway that you might leave people with. Carly, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the biggest takeaway really is, to be kind to yourself and to just remember that we as people are resilient and that healing from trauma is possible. We talked a lot today about the effects of trauma, the impact of trauma, just how widespread and complex it is. And that is all true, but there are also tools and coping mechanisms out there to help us, to help each other, and that we all can heal together and be able to move forward. The last thing is just, I had shared a tool with Deb that at some point we might be able to share. That is a trauma survivor bill of rights, which I think is really cool. It is not mine or JFCS, that's from the National Council for Community Behavioral Healthcare, but hang it up in your office, hang it up at home, and it's really, it's a pretty cool document, so maybe we could take a look at that.
I put it in the comments so anybody can download that.
Thank you.
Terrific. Denise?
For me, I so concur with everything that Carly has shared. Again, as parents, giving yourself permission not to know it all, being okay with that, and participating on the journey with your child. If you are experiencing some of the symptoms that we shared, that certainly identifying it, acknowledging it for yourself and for your child is the first step. And that equips you with your healing power, with your child's healing power. So I just, would like to share that as my last thought, that the resiliency of human beings all together has proven themselves over and over and over again. So you are resilient, your child is resilient, and having this additional information is certainly going to equip you to heal during this time.
Thank you. Carly, thank you. Denise, thank you. Deb, thank you as well. We hope you learned something this evening, and we hope that we were able to help. Thanks for tuning in to JFCS's Facebook Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.